I mean, I think St. Mary's has the most to lose,
Mhm.
right? I mean, they're in the Wooden Legacy, um, and they should win that. They should win that tournament.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
Fresno State's a middle of the road at best. Uh, Mountain West team. Vanderbilt and Washington, I guess, is a little bit better than Vandy, but both of them are bottom half in their high major conferences.
Right.
St. Mary's is on the cusp of that top 25. Um, it's weird talking about a non-Gonzaga team in these Feast Week tournaments
Mhm.
as having a lot to lose rather than a lot to win. But I
Right.
think St. Mary's has put themselves in that conversation of if they don't win the tournament, there's going to be a loss that they regret on their resume. And that's just the way it is.
As we go along, we'll be joined a little bit later by Connor Hope. He is the co-host of the Heat Check Hangout podcast and also a writer for the Almanac. So we'll get a chance to talk to him about all of the tournaments that are happening this week in college basketball, Feast Week, and be able to go through all of that and examine any number of things of like who has the most to lose, who has the most to gain, and all of that. So we'll dive again. This week is when we have a lot of multi-team events. So a lot of tournaments this week. We have the PK85, so the Phil Knight Legacy and the Phil Knight Invitational. Portland and Gonzaga will be taking part in that. The Wooden Legacy down in Anaheim and St. Mary's will be in that. USF starts the Hall of Fame Classic today. And then we also have San Diego at the Las Vegas Classic and BYU in the Battle for Atlantis. And let's rewind and start with the past week, and let's start with Gonzaga, because Gonzaga had a really interesting week. They bounced back and forth between two games, one in Austin against Texas, and then they had Kentucky on Sunday night back at Spokane Arena. And let's start with the Texas game. This was maybe as bad as Gonzaga has looked in a very long time, maybe since the championship game against Baylor. Gonzaga did not rebound well. They did not defend well. They did not protect the ball well. Texas may have had one of their best performances when Gonzaga also had one of its worst. And that combination resulted in the 18-point loss on Wednesday. And it started to bring up a lot of questions about the Zags. Did they have the guard play? Did they have the athletes? Did they have the defensive know-how to be able to compete with these super elite teams? Obviously, we saw how they did against Michigan State. And again, last week I talked about you don't want to read too much into that, because when you're on an aircraft carrier, you're playing in that sort of environment, you kind of take that with a grain of salt and don't read too much into it. But once we saw the game against Texas, there was more to read into. There was more to question. But then even after that, while a number of pundits started to talk about whether or not Gonzaga was still going to be in the mix or whatnot, I think one thing to note was that the national champion last year also lost by 18 in a game to Kentucky. Kansas lost that game by 18 and ended up winning the whole thing. So it's not like a loss like that really is in November is the determining factor. And that's kind of the way I was looking at it. It's like, yes, it was a bad loss. There's no doubt about that. It really highlighted some of the things Gonzaga does not do well and that they needed to fix, especially once they were entering into this murderer's row of games. When you looked at the fact that you had already Michigan State, you already had Texas, you had Kentucky coming up, you had the the PK 85, or yes, you get Portland State, but then you're likely to see West Virginia or Purdue, probably Purdue, and then either Florida or Duke at the back end of that tournament. And then with Baylor following shortly after that. This was always going to be a really tough stretch for Gonzaga, no matter what. And expecting that Gonzaga was going to come out of this nice and shiny, or not having picked up at least a loss or two, I think should not have been expected. It should have been expected that Gonzaga was going to at least hit some bump in the road, that they were going to struggle a bit, because they're facing some of the best teams in the country. And Gonzaga is still really trying to find its groove and find their rotations. Again, we're looking at guys like Hunter Salas, Nolan Hickman, Malachi Smith, Efton Reed, who are all still trying to find their rhythm and their role with this group. Because we know exactly what to expect from the Drew Timmies. We know what to expect from Anton Watson. We know what to expect from Julian Strother. They've been here. They've done that. It's the rest of the guys who've really need to figure out how they were going to mesh with the rest of the group and how they fit in. And also for Mark Few to figure out those rotations, what that was going to look like and everything else. So I wasn't going to read, again, too much into it. I thought that if they went 4-2 over this tough stretch, that I think they'd be just fine. 5-2 over this tough stretch, they'd be just fine. Even if it's 4-3, I think they're just fine. Now, I was saying after the Texas loss, if they had gone up against Kentucky and then lost again in a similar fashion, then maybe we can start to have that conversation. Maybe we can say, maybe Gonzaga's not a title contender anymore. Maybe they have more to work on. Maybe they're a little further away than we thought. But that didn't happen. Sunday rolled around and Gonzaga rebounded and responded as well as you could have anticipated. They brought the energy. They dominated Kentucky on the boards. Yes, Oscar Tshiebwe had his way while he was in the game, but he got into foul trouble. But this was an offense that started to hum. This was a Gonzaga team that crashed the boards hard. You saw a great amount of energy from Drew Timme. Julian Strother had a great game. You had a great first half from Anton Watson. We got to see the guards start to piece it together a little bit more. But again, like, this is a team that we saw Gonzaga really get contributions from top to bottom. Ben Gregg had some solid minutes in there as well. So we're starting to see some contributions from some of the other guys on this team as well. And that's what they're going to need kind of moving forward against teams like the Kentuckys. And as they get to the Purdues and Dukes and the Floridas, the Baylors, and then also Alabama back and then into December. So I didn't want to read too much into what we saw against Kansas. And then same time, I'm not going to read too much into what we saw against Kentucky. But I think what we saw against Kentucky was a team that knows how to be resilient, knows how to respond well to having an awful game. And that is what they had against Texas, an awful game, and they responded very well. But some other teams have responded pretty well in conference so far in the non-conference as well. And I'm going to start with Pepperdine. Pepperdine, we knew going into the season, had the offense. They had enough offense to be able to compete with most everyone. It was always whether they could defend enough. And we saw it on night one against Rice that they put it all together. Then we saw it in game 2 against Fullerton, where the defense did not come to play. Then they had a couple more games against kind of softer opponents, South Alabama, Vanguard. So you're not going to read too much into those games. Those are games they should be able to handle easily, and they did. Then they got UC Irvine on Friday. And this was a team that had already gone to Oregon and won. This was a team that had already seen LMU and beat them. So this was an Irvine team that you really couldn't sleep on, that you really had to be up for. And Pepperdine met the challenge. Pepperdine had to play a much different game than they're used to. This was like an uglier, grinded out game We didn't have great games from Max Lewis, but we had a great performance from Houston Millette. And I think that's more a telling sign for me, is that this Pepperdine team is starting to learn how to win in different ways. That they're not always going to be a high-powered offense. They can't always win that way. That depending on your matchup, you're going to have to figure out to win another way. Again, when Pepperdine ends up seeing St. Mary's later on down the season, you're not going to score 70, 80, 90 points against that team. If you're going to win, you're going to have to learn how to win in the 60s or the low 70s. And I think this is a really good sign for Pepperdine that they're learning how to do this. And they've had 4 different scores through their first 5 games. It's, can they be consistent? Can this team really kind of put it together and be their game in, game out, game in, game out? And they have their first big test, the first big test this week at UCLA. So we'll get to see. Again, I don't expect Pepperdine to beat UCLA, but if they can remain competitive and be able to go up and down the floor with a UCLA team who's probably going to be pretty on point, considering they've just picked up a couple of losses over the weekend. Mick Cronin's going to have that team. I think he's going to have them very well prepared for Pepperdine on Wednesday. So I think this will be a very interesting matchup for the Waves to see if they can really match up to the energy level and the just the talent that UCLA has and what they're going to be able to bring this week. Then let's take a look at LMU. LMU, again, also has had kind of a little bit of an up and down preseason so far. But they went to the Jamaica Classic, opened up with Georgetown, and smacked the Hoyas. Then they go into the championship game against Wake Forest and grind out a really tough and impressive overtime win against the Demon Deacons. LMU, again, I was hinting at it before this season that this team may be better than a lot of us expect. That while, yes, I still picked them 9th, I don't think the distance between them and everybody else is as great as maybe as many think. That I think that LMU still has the talent to be able to compete with a lot of the other teams in the WCC. I don't think that it's out of the question that LMU jumps out of that 9 spot and could end up even as high as 6 or 7. I think they have the talent, and we saw some of that talent on display in that title game. The freshman Chance Stevens, he had 23 points in that final, and he hit the game-winning bucket there in overtime. There's something here. There's something to be said about what LMU is doing. I don't want to completely oversell what's happening so far because we're still very early in the season. This is a team that had been decimated with injuries. And as a number of people have pointed out, one of the big changes is that Eli Scott is no longer in the middle. And he was so ball dominant that at times we didn't see the ball move. We didn't see the balls really whip around the court. And we're starting to see that more and more with this team that is a lot better of a shooting team than we've been able to see over the last couple of years. And also Pacific. Pacific also has been able to come through and be a very good, not very good, but they've looked better than I think many of us expected. They're averaging 88 points a game. They're shooting 48% from the field. And one of the things that was highlighted before the season, this team can't score. They were the worst offensive team in the WCC a year ago, and they have been far more efficient so far this season. They've been far more potent offensively this season. Jordan Ivy Curry is averaging 18 a game. You have 4 players averaging double figures. Pacific is looking like they have at least addressed the problems that they had a year ago. And we'll see how this actually starts to play out. And again, I can say oh, Pacific looks better. The numbers are showing that as well. Pacific started the season somewhere in the 250 range, and KenPom, they're already up hovering around the 200 mark, and even did crack the 200 mark earlier in the week. So there was a one point during the week that every WCC team was in the top 200. No one was 200 or below, which again, for this league where we've had teams like Pacific or Portland or LMU all have not good seasons, drop into the depths there. The fact that everybody has now kind of raised their level, and again, this is what so many have said, is that the WCC as a whole looks better. The WCC as a whole has raised its game. That you no longer have, there's no longer the pushover games. That you don't have teams even at the bottom who are going to be as easily. You can't mark off, just like check off the box as a win anymore. And again, like even because like even in individual performances, and I can't go through this whole podcast and not address the 43-point performance from Eric Williams against Utah State. San Diego also looks like that they're going to be better than some of us thought. Now the KenPom numbers, I think, and the preseason predictors, I think, had this a little bit more than maybe some others, but the Utah State game is, I think, is at least a sign of what San Diego is capable of. San Diego went into the year with a lot of moving pieces, a lot of new parts, really all new parts. And there was a question of how quickly could they gel it together. And then Utah State also was coming off a game where they beat Santa Clara by 22. So this was a Utah State that when they're rolling, they are so dangerous. They are so good. And San Diego hung with them. San Diego hung with Utah State down to the wire, took them to overtime. And yes, they fell short, but I think that says a lot about where San Diego is already and how they're going to mix in with the rest of this WCC, you have up and down teams all over the place. Santa Clara getting one good win and then dropping another. You have San Diego looking like they could beat Utah State, and then they have other performances where they don't look as sharp. Again, they're 3-1, so there's not too, you can't write off San Diego all too much yet. LMU's had been up and down. Pepperdine's been up and down. Gonzaga's already picked up a loss. We only have 2 undefeated WCC teams left, one being St. Mary's, the other one being USF. Everyone has kind of had their bumps in the road, but every team has kind of shown what their potential is, where the ceiling could be, because there's talent up and down this league, a lot of talent up and down this league. And I think we're going to see a lot of it come to fruition by the time we get to conference play. So it's going to be exciting once we get to there. All right. And with that, we're going to bring in Connor Hope. He's the co-host of the Heat Check Hangout podcast, as well as one of the writers for the Almanac. Connor, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. This week is always an exciting week. Feast week, tournament week, turkey week, all of that. There's so much happening. It's almost kind of hard to keep track of who's playing when and all that, because everyone's traveling and all over the place. So most of the WCC teams are involved in one of these tournaments over the weekend. And as you're kind of like going through your calendar, looking at all of these, which tourney are you most intrigued by? Which are you kind of like most excited by?
I mean, it'd be cheating, I think, to say the Phil Knight Invitational, just because I think that's the one that everyone's looking at. I really like this, or I really liked, I should say, the Bahamas championship, right? I mean, it's, I know it's not a feast week tournament, but that one intrigued me a lot heading in. But I think, I mean, right now it's the Phil Knight Invitational, right? Mm-hmm. It's Gonzaga going in to a tournament in which they kind of need to make some noise to make up for the struggles of the first week and a half to get back into that championship conversation. And then I mean, Portland has a tough task, but they can certainly make some noise, especially, in the presumably they're going to lose that first round game. They're going to go into the consolation bracket.
They're
And
going to
I
lose to
think that,
North Carolina. Are you sure?
but I think, if you go into that losers bracket in the Phil Knight, it's, I mean, it's not easy. But there are some teams that I think are going to be in that losers bracket, specifically Iowa State and right now Villanova, that are vulnerable. And Portland can pick up a win. And if they can impress against the other team that they'll face in that losers bracket, um, that's all you can ask for, right? I mean,
Yeah.
similar to what Portland State did, what it was it now 5 years ago, where they went 1-2, but they led Duke at the half. They took Butler down to the wire. They beat Stanford. Like, that's kind of what you're looking for Portland to do. Look competitive in those games against the top 25 teams, and there's what, 5 of them in this Phil Knight Invitational in their bracket, and really try and pick up that win against the Iowa State or the Villanova or whoever you face, if you were to face one of those two teams during that tournament.
Yeah, I mean that there's just so many good teams in those two. If Portland can hang on to one of those, it'd be great. I know Portland hasn't looked the best in the first couple of weeks of the season. They've had their own up and downs. They've been banged up as well. But it'd be great if Portland could actually pick up at least one of those games during the tournament. So,
Mm-hmm.
which amongst all the teams this week, which do you think has the most to gain, or who has the most to prove from the teams that we have?
I mean, I think St. Mary's has the most to lose,
Mhm.
right? I mean, they're in the Wooden Legacy, and they should win that. They should win that tournament.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
Fresno State's a middle of the road at best. Mountain West team. Vanderbilt and Washington, I guess, is a little bit better than Vandy, but both of them are bottom half in their high major conferences.
Right.
St. Mary's is on the cusp of that top 25. It's weird talking about a non-Gonzaga team in these Feast Week tournaments as having a lot to lose rather than a lot to win. But I
Right.
think St. Mary's has put themselves in that conversation of, if they don't win the tournament, there's going to be a loss that they regret on their resume. And that's just the way it is.
Right. Because the way it shakes out, like you're right. And I agree. They should come out of Anaheim with 2 wins. That shouldn't actually shake them. But if they were to drop one of those, then it puts more pressure on, like the San Diego State game down the road, puts more pressure on that Wyoming game, or even, like, not to think they're beating Houston, but like that puts a little bit more pressure to have a good showing against Houston just in a couple weeks.
Right.
But because there's also some teams I feel like BYU is like, they're in the battle for Atlantis, and like they're a team that's like, they've been so, like, they have not been impressive really at any point outside of like maybe the first 10 minutes of San Diego State. Could they, is there something they could do in that tournament that's going to maybe change the perception, or are they capable of changing the perception of what they are this year in that tournament?
Yeah, right. I mean, they face USC. That's a game. If they're looking to get into the tournament, that's a game they have to have. USC hasn't looked impressive. They could turn it around. And if you're talking about the Pac-12, you're talking about 3, maybe 4. Well, at this point, it's 3, maybe 4. Before the season, it was probably 4, maybe 5 tournament teams. USC being right in that mix. But USC is the most vulnerable team in this tournament outside of BYU. BYU, if they beat USC, I believe they go against Butler or Tennessee. Probably Tennessee. That's a loss you can take as BYU. That's a really tough game. And then they're going against the loser of the other side, which my assumption would be Dayton, because I think it's going to be Dayton, Kansas. So if BYU can come out of this tournament with wins over USC and potentially Dayton, and a loss against Tennessee, like that's a really, really, really good tournament for BYU. You know, maybe bordering on an A or a B level tournament for BYU, even if they don't win it.
Right.
But again, if they lose to USC, then you're talking about them being in the same side of the bracket with Butler, Wisconsin, NC State, who have all looked good early, but are not necessarily the teams that you're talking about as, top teams in their conference. And so, very losable games as well, right? There's not a single team in this battle for Atlanta. Like as good as the Maui field is, there's not a single team in this battle for Atlantis tournament that I think is weak.
Right.
But there's a bunch of vulnerable teams, and losses to those vulnerable teams, I think, could be damaging to an at-large bid for BYU.
Yeah, I mean BYU. I think many probably like they were probably on that cusp, if not a little below the cusp of a tournament team. And if they can have a good showing here, it'd be great for their resume. I'm still not. Still don't think they've really figured out where they're going offensively. They still seem so scattered, and they haven't been able to put it together yet so far this season. Um, looking at the rest of it, it's like we do have San Diego, who's in the Las Vegas Classic. They have New Mexico State, and that's going to be a solid opportunity for them. Looking at USF and the Hall of Fame Classic, a tournament that's already done, and I don't know how much I should read into what LMU did over the weekend, beating Georgetown, beating Wake Forest. Obviously, like those are two bottom tier teams in each of those power conferences, but LMU's starting to look like if they can stay healthy, like they could at least be maybe more competitive than we originally thought in the WCC.
Yeah, I mean, I think LMU is an interesting case because they I don't think they're bad, right? Like the talent wise, I think they're middle of the road WCC. Coaching was the question, but also like I just think last year was weird for LMU, right?
Yeah.
Like it wasn't what you were expecting out of Loyola Marymount. And so the fact that they were able to be as successful as they were in Montego Bay was in that division of the Jamaica Classic was good. Right. And so they're still probably middle of the road, bottom half of the WCC, but that's not saying anything bad about them, just because I think LMU and I think the WCC as a whole has looked relatively competitive through the first, couple weeks of the season. And so they picked up big wins, and ultimately LMU being good, or LMU at least impressing in the non-conference, is good for the rest of the conference because it heightens those games in conference in terms of their contribution to the resumes.
I mean, I've been looking at just like the performances of talking about that bottom half of the league. We're talking about them, the Pepperdines, Pacific, San Diego. It's like looking at what they've done in the non-conference, I think they've done more, maybe a little better than anticipated early on. Like LMU definitely, I think, has done a little bit better and been more consistent. Even Pacific has actually looked like they've at least found some level of offense. They're averaging I think 88 a game so far. And again, like this is a team that it was pretty unanimous on they're going to be the last team in this conference, but even they've actually looked like they've improved at least a good amount from where we saw them a year ago.
Yeah. And the thing with Pacific that I like is it looks like their team has gotten back to what the identity was when Stoudemire was there. Like last year, there was just a bunch of turnover. I don't really think that Perry had the guys he wanted. But this Pacific team, they're just grinders, right? They might not have the most talented roster. But if you were to look at their roster when they were finishing 4th and 5th in the WCC, like that wasn't the most talented roster either. But it was just a bunch of players who tried really hard, got at the basket, got at it on defense. And that's kind of what I'm seeing from Pacific early on this year. And so just based on that fact, I think going into this Pacific MTE against the teams that they're going to be playing, similar to St. Mary's, just on a lesser scale, because they're not necessarily trying to build an NCAA tournament resume, win those games, right? It's a home game against Mount St. Mary's. It's a home game against Idaho. It's a home game against Cal Poly. Win those games.
Yeah.
And if you can take, maybe not all three of them, just because I think winning 3 games in 6 days is difficult. But if you can take 2 of those 3 and keep the third one close, like that's what the WCC needs from Pacific in this week.
Yeah. I mean, again, like early, just at some point during the week, everyone was in the top 200, which again, considering where Pacific started, where LMU was a year ago, where even Pepperdine was a year ago, that's just huge strides for like the conference as a whole, because we're starting to see the bottom is also getting better.
Right.
So one that's not involved in an MTE this week, but has an interesting opportunity, probably a big opportunity, is Pepperdine. They're coming off I think a really good win against Irvine, and now they're going to have UCLA at UCLA. And I know this is a UCLA team who's probably actually going to be more focused than they normally would be, coming off a couple losses of their own. But this seems like we know that Pepperdine has the offensive ability to hang with most everybody. It was always about it's whether they can defensively be there as well. What do you kind of like see out of that UCLA game this coming week? Is this going to be like Mick Cronin's going to have them just so focused that Pepperdine's just going to get steamrolled, or is Pepperdine going to be able to hang with this team for a while?
I mean, it comes down to scoring, right? UCLA, when they're on, can get after you defensively. And so I think it's just you just have to score. And you have to get that balanced scoring attack to really be on full display. I think UCLA is going to come into that game angry. They did not perform the way that they wanted to in their tournament. So from that perspective, it's going to be a double-digit loss. It's about looking competitive, right? For these games against top 25 teams from the middle to bottom half of the WCC, it's not about winning. It's about looking competitive. It's about looking like you belong on the floor with them, even if you lose by double digits, right? It's, can we lose by 15 as opposed to by 30? That's the question in this game. And we've seen that from Pepperdine before, obviously with different players, with, some more, I think, individual star power. But this Pepperdine team, I like the potential that it has moving forward. It's a little bit disappointing that the Diamond Head Classic is so late in the year.
Yeah.
Because I would have really liked to see them play in the Diamond Head Classic during Thanksgiving. I think that just makes sense. But again, having the Diamond Head Classic be one of those that tournament that happens around Christmas, I think is perfect for them too. So their time to impress in a tournament is coming. But again, I wouldn't be concerned about a loss to UCLA unless it's clear that UCLA just doesn't belong, or not UCLA, that Pepperdine just doesn't belong on the floor with them.
It'd be the talk of everybody if it's shown that UCLA doesn't belong on the same floor as Pepperdine.
Right. Right.
Flip that is like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
The WCC overall just seems like there's talent up and down each of these rosters, and maybe just like again more talent than we've seen top to bottom, maybe ever. But just looking at like what the conferences, I guess what these the tournaments look like, there's a lot of great opportunities for the teams here. Just before we go, it's like what's a team before we get to conference play that you think is going to, maybe outside of like the Gonzaga St. Mary's, that's really going to make an imprint on the rest of their non-conference, or maybe have the best non-conference the rest of the way?
Oh, that's a good question. I think San Francisco has a really good shot at impressing. And it's not like they have those big marquee wins, right? But, if they can beat Davidson on the road, if they can beat Utah State in that semi-home, if they can compete with, if they can go on the road against UNLV and Davidson and come away 1-1, If they can beat Utah State and Arizona State at home, they're going to be heading into the conference season with what, 2, maybe 3 losses, and a relatively good strength of schedule. And again, not overly impressive, but given that it's Gurlifson's first year as the head coach, after losing Todd Golden, entering that conference season with 3 losses is a huge win for them, considering I think they were projected by Ken Palm for like 5 or 6. So yeah, I think San Francisco has, obviously they're 4-0, but they have a quietly good enough non-conference where I think if they enter the conference play with that 2, 3, I mean, even 4 losses, you've got to be impressed. Santa Clara struggles early. I wouldn't even call them struggles because Utah State and UCF are really good teams. But the fact that they have the 2 losses and the rest of their non-conference schedule is pretty easy up until you face UC Irvine and Boise State. Iona's going to be tough, but I think Santa Clara can win that one. I'm just looking at schedules because that's really what dictates who can impress.
Right.
San Diego probably has the best chance to turn things around, given that it is Steve Lavin, so eyes are going to be on them. UNLV is going to be tough. They get the road game against Arizona State, which is vulnerable. UC Riverside on the road. I don't know if outside of St. Mary's, I'm rambling. Sorry. I don't know if outside of St. Mary's, BYU, and Gonzaga, any of these teams have those marquee matchups that I think they have a good shot at winning. But there's a lot of them, specifically in the middle of this conference, that I think have a good chance of, when we enter conference play, you're going to look at the Ken Palm rankings, you're going to look at the records, you're going to look at the strength of schedules for these WCC teams, and you're going to say, oh, they're much better than they looked because all I've been paying attention to is Gonzaga and St. Mary's and BYU.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's some sneaky good games on a lot of these schedules. And if they can hang on and at least be half decent through the course of the non-conference, yeah, I think the USFs, the Santa Clara's, I think Pepperdine, I think their record's going to look better. And I think they're going to keep climbing if they at least can be a little consistent on the defensive end. And I think that's just they're going to be the key for them.
Pepperdine, and I feel bad for Pepperdine and I think it's LMU, just because they're tougher. Like San Francisco at least gets some of those tough middle of like the high 80s to low 120s in Ken Palm at home.
Yeah.
But LMU, it's they get Nevada at home, but they're Colorado State, Grand Canyon, Utah State. Those are all on the road or at neutral sites, right? Pepperdine's similar. I think they get Grand Canyon in Arizona as well, which is a tough one. And then they do get Nevada and UC Santa Barbara at home. But I think Nevada is just a tough team, and UC Santa Barbara at their ceiling is also a really good team.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Connor, for hopping on. We'll catch up down the road, and happy feast week. Happy Thanksgiving.
I looked down at the heat check matchup index, and the fact that it's filled with green is a good thing. And I know I've spoken about this. The slow roll is good for basketball. And I think Feast Week is going to prove it, right? These teams, outside of Kentucky, you can throw UCLA and TCU in there. Not a lot of these top teams, have really had anything to worry about. But it's also given some of these WCC and mid-major teams the opportunity to get good wins against each other. And the WCC has definitely delivered, I think, more than a lot of these other, high-level mid-major conferences. So, they're not Gonzaga and St. Mary's are probably the only two that I'm looking at as they have to win their tournament to impress. But, if the other teams can pick up some wins, that's brilliant for the WCC.
Right. All right. Thanks again, Connor. We'll catch up down the road, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Zach.
All right. One more time, I'd like to thank Connor Hope for hopping on and chatting some tournament basketball with us. And one of the key things I wanted to kind of take from what Connor said was the team who has the most to lose, and that's St. Mary's. And I agree. I think it's a pretty fair assessment that going into the Wooden Legacy, they'll start with Vanderbilt, and then they will later have either Washington or Fresno State. And these are all teams that St. Mary's should beat. These are teams that there should be little to no doubt about how much better St. Mary's is than these teams. This should be 1 win, 2 win, move on. And then even next week against New Mexico, that's a game that, while I don't think it's going to be an easy game, I think this is a game that still St. Mary's should win. And with the remaining games on the schedule, what we've seen from St. Mary's thus far, if we think St. Mary's has kind of taken that next leap, there's no reason to believe that they should not be 8-0 by the time they see Houston on the 3rd, which is, again, just a little over a week away. And that Houston game is going to be interesting. Just watching some of the clips of the Houston-Oregon game on Sunday, for any St. Mary's fan who has not watched any of Houston thus far, this is a team that's maybe as disciplined as St. Mary's is on the defensive end, with just better athletes. This is going to be something to see. Again, like watching some of that, you understand why Houston is one of the favorites to win a championship this season. And for St. Mary's, again, like we're talking about like how well they've played and why they should be expected to walk into that game at 8-0, walk into the Wooden Legacy as the clear favorite to win that tournament. This team has still been the best defensive team in the WCC thus far. This team continues to be disciplined. And I saw the tweet over the weekend of when they were playing Hofstra, and I completely agree. It was that what they were doing to Hofstra was about as the way St. Mary's beats you is clinical and unassuming. And that's exactly what it is. It's clinical and unassuming. They are going to beat you, and you're not going to realize by how bad until you look up at the scoreboard. They just play solid defense. They don't beat themselves. And then they take advantage of every one of your mistakes. And as we head into tournament week, that's something that St. Mary's will have to continue to do to pick up a couple more wins. It's something Gonzaga will also have to do if they are also going to pick up a win in the PK 85. Again, they have one of the toughest roads to do. And for St. Mary's to impress, they really have to win their tournaments. They're at that stage where it's like nothing short of that makes a performance by them impressive. And then again, a number of the other teams in the WCC, I think, are going to have real opportunities throughout the course of the non-conference, not just the remainder of this week, to continue to show that this league is improving as a whole. Again, they don't need to win every last game. They don't need to beat every last key opponent, but this is a league that's improving more and more by the day. And we're starting to see some of the fruits of the labor that we've seen from the Pepperdines, some of the San Diegos, the LMUs. USF is hanging in there as I'm recording this. They are still 4-0, and one of the two remaining undefeateds. Santa Clara has talent. I think we're still waiting for some of the returners to return to kind of form what we saw a year ago. And then also, like for BYU, we're also looking to see if they can actually be more consistent on the offensive end. It at times does seem like that they don't necessarily know where the ball is going to go, which might actually make them more dangerous, because now you can't just key on the one guy, like keying on Alex Barcelo. You have to really be able to defend every last man on the court. And we saw a really nice night the other night against Nicholls State, again, when they Ali Atiki had a really good night. Gideon George has a good night. Fus Traore had a good night. So we're starting to see BYU maybe start to kind of put it together or whatnot. But we need to see them do it against better opponents. And the battle for Atlantis will be their first opportunity to really show what they can do. All right, well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite streaming service. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. You can search Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast to find it. Follow me on Twitter at Post by Zach, also on TikTok and Instagram at Post by Zach for content there as well. And that'll do it. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody, and I'll catch you next week.